Good afternoon and good evening, everybody. Welcome to the fourth NEI Digital Round Table, Creative Writing Towards a Pedagogy. Today, we will reflect on aspects of both theory-driven and practice-driven creative writing teaching. Focus on the role, of course, of creative writing, but also that of the creative writer in the academy, and to quote from Paul Perry, one of our speakers today, beyond the academy, as he has put it in the introduction to the collection of essays, Beyond the Workshop, Creative Writing, Theory and Practice. So thank you very much, Paul, Marina, Kathleen, George, and Aline, for taking part in this discussion. This fourth roundtable is organized by the Núcleo of Irish Studies at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, and it's a part of a series that aims to discuss aspects of our research here with writers and scholars from Ireland. Paul Perry from UCD visits us for the first time today, unfortunately only digitally, but both Marina Carr from DCU and Kathleen McCracken from Ulster University have been in Brazil before, for academic events and for the launch of their work, translated by Aline Fernandes, who translated By the Bog of Cats, and by José Roberto O'Shea, who translated a collection of poems by Kathleen McCracken. And Aline Fernandes and Jorge Mouzinho join us today from UFSC as co-chair and speaker. So before introducing our first guest, I would like to thank also the Consulate General of Ireland via the Deputy Consul General of Ireland, Jill Hannenberry, for the continued support of Irish studies in Brazil, particularly at UFSC. So thank you very much for being with us this afternoon, Jill.
Thank you, Beatrice. And thank you for inviting me here today to open what promises to be a very stimulating discussion around creative writing towards a pedagogy. A very warm welcome to our speakers, Marina, Paul, Kathleen, Georgie, Aline, and to all those tuning in. It is my privilege to be here this afternoon representing the Irish Consulate to acknowledge the phenomenal contribution which Beatrice and all of the Irish Studies team at UFSC have made and continue to make to the promotion of Irish studies and to the development and evolution of Irish culture as seen through the more globalised, more multicultural, contemporary lens of the 21st century. The Núcleo de Estudos Irlandeses in Florianópolis is dedicated to innovative and pioneering research and to sharing these ideas across a global network of academics and wider society, with today's event the perfect illustration of this. Creative writing, or storytelling at its heart, has a strong and ancient tradition in Irish culture. Before stories were written down, the Seanachie, or storyteller in Irish, would memorise and recite the stories of Irish mythology and legend. They were the keepers of Irish folklore, the teachers. As stories were passed down orally through the generations, nowadays recorded in written form, capturing the narratives, the themes, and the characters, which continue to influence many writers to this day. Indeed, the first of Ireland's 4 Irish-born Nobel Prize winners for literature, W.B. Yeats, used these stories as inspiration for his own creative works, while also compiling and editing some of them into collections, such as Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry. These stories and traditions form part of who we are today. The importance of creativity in the Irish identity is underlined by Creative Ireland, Ireland's 5-year programme, which connects people. Can everyone still hear me? I'm sorry, my computer is completely frozen, but I think you guys can hear me. Great. Let me just catch up. Which connects, so Creative Ireland connects people, creativity, and well-being. And it is a commitment to support people to engage with Irish culture at a local, national, and international level.
Thank you very much, Jill. It's always a pleasure to have the Irish Consulate with us in our events. So thank you again for the great support you've been giving us all these years. So let's introduce our first speaker, we will introduce them as we move on through the roundtable, as we move round through the roundtable. So our first speaker today, Paul Perry, is the award-winning and critically acclaimed author of several books of poetry and prose. A winner of the Hennessy Prize for Irish Literature, he's a poet, novelist. Sorry, missed your. I missed your. It doesn't matter. He's a poet, novelist, and screenwriter. He has published several books of poetry, novels, and this year, his latest novel, The Garden, has been praised as being exceptional. So, Paul, thank you very much for being here with us. And just trying to find my questions. Yeah, so let's begin with perhaps what is the central issue of teaching and learning, the students. In general, what's a creative writing student looking for? What do we want or need as educators to teach students? And what are the interdisciplinary subjects which will foster students' development as creative writers?
Thanks, Beatrice, and pleasure to be here among a really distinguished panel. So thank you for having me. To go to your first question, I might just talk briefly about my own experience, which was as a student in Dublin at a German school, where I was introduced to, I suppose, international literature. So not just the W.B. Yeats, not just the Liam O'Flahertys, but the Heinrich Bowles and the Gunter Grasses, and indeed the Christa Wolfs of the world. And I suppose for any aspiring writer, it's important to be inspired by the literature that you've been introduced to and the literature that you aspire to write. In my own home growing up, there were a smattering of books and music, and I suppose the older you get, you come back to memories that may have been locked away. And I remember asking my parents once, why did you have so few records, musical records? And they said, well, because yourself and your brother destroyed them all as youngsters. But one of those records was actually a recording of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein by Richard Burton. And it was just this ghostly, eerie baritone voice coming from a turntable in the corner of the living room, and really just, inspiring us. And as Jill said, this is storytelling at its heart. We can use the Academy's vocabulary like pedagogy, and indeed creative writing has become an academic discipline. But at its heart, I think Jill is right. We're talking about storytelling. And to fast forward a little bit to when I was a student of Brendan Kennelly's at Trinity College, he once, during one class, closed the shutters on a bright spring day like it is today, where I'm calling from in Dublin, and he would say to us, "Give us an owl story," and this is during course time. This was part of our learning, and it was a really, I think, important exercise. So even though a lot of our students are looking for close textual guidance and mentorship, there is something important about just the ability to be able to tell a good story. And I think that can start off the page. I remember seeing one of Marina's plays, actually you mentioned it, by the Bog of Cats, and being just electrified by it. Having seen nothing like it. Of course, it goes back to, a tradition inherited or otherwise, back to the Greeks. but it also felt like these accents and this part of Ireland had never been seen on an Irish stage before. And I think that's important. That's something that Frank O'Connor talks about in his book about the short story called The Lonely Voice, where he talks about giving a voice to writers, giving a voice to marginalized communities. So I suppose what I'm trying to say by way of introduction is that creative writing is a kind of, it's an empowering discipline within the academy. I think you see that in the appetite, the growing appetite we see in our own students for creative writing courses. Formerly, it may have been classics, English literature, comparative literature. Now they want to tell their own stories. And I think, you know, there's been an incredible shift in Irish culture, in any case, where we're seeing a new generation of writers who have gained the confidence for whatever reason and are looking for the tools to tell their own stories. That's really important. And I think as educators, we're trying to facilitate that. So I see the kind of creative writing teacher, if you like. I don't even like that word. I see, you know, I don't see us as instructors even. I see us as facilitators. So that we're, you know, and George, before we came on, talked about a community. And I think that's what you're doing as a lecturer or professor in creative writing. You're creating a community for your students that you will participate in, but that will help enable them and empower them to tell the stories that they think are important to make meaning and to find meaning in this, you know, in this contradictory, painful world that we live in. So that's by way of introduction.
Thank you very much, Paul. The idea of community is really important. And in this academic community, of course, we are not alone in English or literature or literary studies. So what can creative writing scholars or students learn from other practices, other practice-based disciplines, such as drama, music, visual arts? Can we learn from them too and integrate with these other disciplines?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that the dialogue between the art forms is really important. There were a slew of books coming out earlier in the 2000s about whether creative writing could be taught, whether it was a worthy enough subject to be taught. And you would hear debates and you would read articles, actually not so long ago, whereas we were also looking across the Atlantic at the United States, who had creative writing programs embedded within their third level institutions since the 1930s. And I do remember, you know, coming across one article which, when Nabokov came to teach in one of the universities, the response was, you know, will the elephants now teach zoology? So it seemed preposterous that writers would teach literature or writing once upon a time. And yet, you know, students look to the practitioners. So at UCD, we talk about creative writing as practice-led research. So the research is the practice, the writing is the research. And actually, I'm of the mind that even though in our module handbooks and such that we have to write out what the learning outcomes of said module is, whether it's introduction to creative writing or advanced fiction practice or what have you, but that actually some of those bullet points should be left blank in a kind of a, you know, I'm interested in this kind of rhizomatic pedagogy where you actually don't know what you're going to find out. It's a journey of discovery. You don't, you know, if you knew what you were going to learn, well, what would the point be in the journey? So I think going back to other disciplines, you know, music and the visual arts have had this for a long time. The idea of the studio, the idea of working under a master, of working under, whether it's a violinist. I happen to be married to a violinist, and you know, and seeing who she's worked with, whether it's Elizabeth Wallfish or Maya Homburger, but these Baroque specialists, and how it's almost a kind of a vocational, pursuit. It is handing on what you've learned. And I was lucky enough, I suppose why I have a passion, not just for writing, but for education, is that I was lucky enough to have some great writers. Brown University was C.D. Wright and Michael Harper. And Michael Harper, of course, was heavily influenced by jazz music and the Harlem Renaissance. And C.D. Wright, just reading, and sadly, these teachers of mine are, have passed away. So I think, from one generation to the next, we want to pass on what those things are. But just reading a poem by C.D. Wright recently, More Blues and the Abstract Truth, a great jazz standard album of the jazz canon. And I suppose what we can learn from those other practices is that they take seriously, and they have done for years, the education of emerging artists in their own art form. They don't question it. It's, and I think we've reached a stage now, or we need to, where we don't need to question it anymore. What we need to do is just invest in young writers. And I think one really encouraging thing is you have an institution like the Museum of Literature Ireland, who have a bursary now called the Edna O'Brien Bursary for secondary school students. So students between the age of 15 and 17 who are given the chance to work and be mentored by a published writer. And I think that's incredible. And that's only, it's in the second year. And that's incredibly exciting for somebody who went through the school system in Ireland in the 1980s and the 1990s, where our school books, our literature books were made up of writers who were deceased. Wonderful books that they were, the Patrick Kavanaghs and W.B. Yeats. There was no Ivan Boland in there. I think Thomas Kinsella, I'm talking about soundings, Marina will probably remember it, but maybe Thomas Kinsella might have been the only poet alive in that book that we were reading. So when it was introduced, what is it now, 30 years ago, this idea of a transition year, a year between our exam cycles where you could try things out. I had a teacher, and this was the start for me, who asked me about poems that I was writing and spent time with me. And that to me was an absolutely magical year. And it was the start for me. And I went on to study with some great people, including, as I mentioned to you, Nelida Pinhon, the great Brazilian novelist, when I was a student of creative writing at Master of Fine Arts level at the University of Miami. And she opened up a whole new world of Brazilian authors and South American authors that, to be honest, I had never heard of as a 25-year-old. So I think that's a really important thing, looking at the visual arts, looking at film, looking at music, and looking at how seriously they take the investment in the artists that are emerging in their own art forms.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So in this process of learning from other areas and not knowing where we're going, there is a central issue when we talk about the classroom and now the screen room, which is the workshop. You even titled your book Beyond the Workshop. So how suitable is the workshop model to the teaching of creative writing?
Yeah, it's a question that's preoccupied myself and some other teachers of creative writing, instructors, facilitators for a number of years. I really think it depends on the level that you're talking about, and that, you know, it can be a very useful model, the workshop model, the idea that you're in a safe space and that you're looking at constructive criticism and work that will be praised, and you're looking at a kind of a descriptive feedback rather than a judgment. I think that's really important. And then if you can find a workshop or a community that offers you that, that can be transformative. So that, you know, that's really important. But I think the workshop is best suited to more advanced writers, or writers who at least have had some experience in writing and have built up some confidence. So that I find our first years in UCD, I feel like what they need actually is a confidence building year, to make mistakes and take risks, and to be told that that's okay. And that's actually part of your development, and that will help. Write something that does not have, you know, a Joycean epiphanic ending as a short story. Write a fragment and let's talk about it, and let's talk about the, you know, the things that make it or don't make it a story or a flash fiction. I mean, the other thing is, I feel like, you know, I'm learning a tremendous amount from the students, and that their interests and the forms that they're writing in are becoming much more fluid, that there's a kind of hybridization of what they want to say. Because, you know, I'm perfectly willing to admit and hold up my hands that I grew up on the other side of the digital divide, if you like. So that I'm a migrant to the digital world, whereas they're inhabitants of it, and they grew up. You know, I look at my 10-year-old daughter and see her moving her hands around a screen and not knowing how she's doing what she's doing, opening up multiple screens at the same time, and learning from her. And I think, you know, if the workshop can offer that kind of dialogue, so that it's not a direct transfer of knowledge from teacher to student, but that it is this community of practice where in that discussion something is learned. Now, I think the challenge is that many of our students want to be able to say, I learned A, B, and C today, but actually it's a process. And that process takes a lot of time. The process might not actually metamorphose into a product, whether it's a play, a poem, a short story, or a novel, or something else in between, or something I don't even have the words for yet, until long after the course or the module or the degree is finished. But what you're hoping to do, I suppose, is to spark that interest. And sometimes the workshop is appropriate for that. And other times it could be, you know, it could be an independent study or a special study in something. So what I'm trying to offer at UCD are other ways of learning. And I suppose one thing that we are discovering today is that our students do learn in different ways. Now, if we give them a block of text, they're not going to process it in the same way. And that it's, you know, and obviously if you've got dozens or hundreds of students, it's difficult to individually tailor your provision of creative writing to each and every one of them. However, I think, you know, within the course of 4 years, there is, you know, as their ally and facilitator and instructor, you try to find a way that works for them. So I would say, you know, it's quite a, you know, meandering answer, because I don't think it is black and white. I think the workshop can be very appropriate for students at a very at a certain advanced level, but at other levels it's great to bring in exercises in the same way that, you know, a pianist might learn the scales, and that you're asking students to, you know, write a 5-line poem that has 5 beats and that uses a certain meter or introduces colors or the names of your parents. And really I suppose what I'm trying to do with the non-workshop pedagogy of creative writing is surprise the student into writing something different that they may not have written anyway. In other words, I think a lot of our students and student writers come in with an idea of what it is to be a writer and what it is to write. And they have an idea, they're almost straight-jacketed by the notion of what it is they should or shouldn't write. And I think a good creative writing facilitator will prize that straitjacket open and allow them to think differently and maybe more broadly about what is possible for them to do, and to get them to surprise themselves, in fact. Because, you know, very often our greatest success stories in UCD are students who come in saying, I've got a novel I want to write, I've been thinking about it for 10 years. In fact, I've been working on it for 10 years. And then if they've having left that novel behind, started something new and are on their way to finishing it, it's an incredibly liberating experience. So in some ways, what we're trying to do is to unlearn things with them, things that they have built up over the years, preconceptions, preconceived ideas of what they think they should be writing about and how they should do it. And very often it's not the right fit. And I think that's an individual thing, and it's, you know, it takes time as well. That's the other point.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Of course, I would have a lot more to ask you, and we hope to be able to greet you in person in the near future in Florianopolis. But I will now pass the screen on to Aline Fernandes, who has been sharing the chairing with me in the roundtables, and she'll talk to Marina Carr.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Hello, Marina. Lovely to have you here with us once again, although just digitally, but it's great to be here with you. So I'm going to first introduce you briefly. Marina Carr's plays to date, it's a very long list: Ulalu, Low in the Dark, The May, Portia Coughlin, By the Bog of Cats, On Rafters Hill, Ariel, Woman in Scarecrow, The Cordelia Dream, Marble, 16 Possible Glimpses, and the list goes on and on. She has also made adaptations to the stage: Anna Karenina, Blood Wedding, and she's also written plays for children such as Meat and Salt and The Giant Blue Hand. Some of her future projects include the premiere of her new play, The Boy, at the Abbey Theatre, and a new adaptation of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. Her work has been produced by the Abbey Theatre, The Gate, Druid, Landmark, the Royal Court, Wyndham Theatre, the Royal Shakespeare Company, the Tricycle, the MacArthur Theatre, San Diego Rep, Milwaukee Rep in the US. She is translated into many languages and produced around the world. She also wrote a new contemporary translation of Rigoletto for Opera Theatre Company, which toured Ireland in 2015, and wrote an original oratorio, Mary Gordon, as part of a commission for Wicklow County Council that brought together choirs from throughout County Wicklow with solo singers and the RTE National Symphony Orchestra in November 2016. She has also been awarded several prizes, such as the Wyndham Campbell Prize in 2017 for her body of work, the Susan Smith Blackburn Prize, the American Ireland Fund Award, the E.M. Forster Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Macaulay Fellowship, the Pewter Bar Fellowship, and she's also a member of the Istana. She has taught at Trinity, at Villanova, and at Princeton. Currently, she lectures in the English department at Dublin City University. She is published by the Gallery Press, Nick Books, and Faber and Faber. Now, Marina, my very first question to you is, could you tell us about the importance of reading and learning how to write for the theatre? Do you find it important? How important is that?
I think there's nothing more important. Thank you, Alina, for that very long introduction, and lovely to be here, everybody. I think reading, there's nothing more important, and it's the single thing I stress with the students is reading other writers. You know, I think that's what we're first inspired by. What we have read, writers are inspired by other writers, and anyone who says otherwise to you is not being completely truthful, I think. And there was this kind of thing going around for generations, you know, about the, not to take from the, you know, the but you know, that there was this, that the, you know, that writers were born, not made, all of that. I'm not disputing that. I think in part writers are born, but I think to become a writer, you need to feed that flame, and you need to fill that well. And as Paul was saying, you know, it is a craft. It's a craft, and so much of a craft has to be learned. And how you learn is by reading deeply into the genre you're interested in yourself, but also outside your own genre and outside your own discipline, into other art forms. So that would be the thing I would focus probably most on with my students, is what they're reading and how much they're reading and how they're reading, because there's a particular way of reading when you're a writer as well. You know, there's reading for enjoyment, and then there's reading like a vulture or like a raven or like a, you know, what is it Shakespeare called it? The Autoclus character, snapper up of unconsidered trifles. Your magpie eye peeled for an astounding image or metaphor that you can somehow take away and transform into something that goes into your bloodstream and emerges as something you've made your own. It's what writers have done since time began. It's what storytellers have done. If you look at Homer, if you look at the Odyssey written down, looking at Fegel's one again recently, and the set pieces, the repetitions. There were, you know, the oral form as the kind of primal form, and that things like rhythm mattered, things like the spoken word mattered, and just to add to that, reading as well, I suppose reading aloud would be one of the things I would really stress with my students, because, you know, we all know what looks great on the page, and particularly the printed page now, and we're all writing on laptops, etc., and everything looks too good before it should. When you read it out loud, the ear catches what the eye misses. So you hear all the glitches, you hear the rhythm gone wrong. You're probably well aware of this, but I was fascinated by this detail. Like before Chaucer, apparently everybody read out loud because books were a very rare commodity. So people would gather to hear a book, and they thought Chaucer was incredibly odd because they would find him in rooms reading to himself. And that idea of reading silently is recent enough. If you think in the history of the species, that it was out loud, it was communal, it was rhythm based. So yeah, I couldn't stress it strongly enough with the students to be reading voraciously.
Thank you, Marina. Since you mentioned the canon and the classics, let's go back to the classics. What's the importance of learning the Greeks and the canon in relation to contemporary voices?
Well, I think, yeah, I know my own experience. I mean, my experience of the classics were pretty scanty until my 20s, until I went to university. So it was the 2 Shakespeare plays that I did for junior cert and leaving cert. It was Wuthering Heights. It was a book I found in my mother's room called My Childhood by Maxine Gorky, which I loved. It was just lying there. She was reading it, obviously. But it wasn't a whole lot. I mean, there was mythology, Greek mythology and Irish mythology in the classroom by way of encyclopedias and by way of my mother's teaching, because she taught me. She was the principal in the local national school, and she was big into mythology. So that was the limit of my sort of serious reading until 17, 18. I went to university, and then English and UCD. There were fantastic teachers there, and they just flung everything at you. And it was assumed you would read. You would read. I mean, we kind of assume now with our students that they should read everything. I mean, I didn't by no means read everything I was meant to read as an undergraduate, but I had a fair good stab at it, and that kind of brought me on a bit. In terms of a bit more Shakespeare, in terms of introducing me to American playwrights, in terms of we didn't do any Greek stuff. In philosophy, I did a bit of Plato, but so that was kind of a taster, and then I think you kind of feel your way around. I remember summer, because my father was a playwright, and he had all these books obviously in his study, and he had the study locked when we were kids, because apparently we went in, it was a bit like Paul's story. We ransacked all his books and destroyed them and left them in bad order. So he locked his study up. But then there came a point where he would, every couple of weeks, whatever, he'd ask you what you're reading, and he'd offer you some books. And this summer I'd failed my first year philosophy. No, it wasn't philosophy. I did well in my economics. I don't know what I was ever doing economics, but anyway, I was doing economics as part of my first year exams, and I had to repeat the economics paper, which he wasn't happy about. But and among them was Ibsen and Strindberg. So I spent a summer reading them, and that got me on to European stuff. And then, bits and pieces, and you gradually build it up. And then you go through phases. Then I went through a phase, I just wanted to read contemporary fiction. And I read all that for about 10 years, kind of OD'd on it, to be honest. So much so that I've kind of stopped now. I'm going to give it a little break for a while. And then there was the poetry phase, and it was... I had an old friend who was a playwright who was mad into the Russian poets. So it was Akhmatova and Mandelstam and Tsvetaeva and Pasternak. So that was another phase. And then was American poetry. And then, so I mean, you are, as a writer, you are a magpie. And then starting to approach the Greek classic plays. So I thought at some point, okay, I had written a few plays, and, sort of the name, you're a playwright, or people would ask you what you're doing, and, you'd say, kind of whisper, out of the side of your mouth, I'm a playwright. And then I think, God, what does that mean? I'm a playwright. So I said, I better read, I better go back. So I went back and started looking at the three big lads as they are, Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides, and mining them, and then reading the mythology surrounding. So that, yeah, I think it is. I think it's incredibly. I don't know. You don't start off. You can't start off knowing much. None of us do. But I think, when you're writing, you'll get through on a wing and a prayer with the first couple of plays, and your own you know, your own kind of elevated sense of your destiny and what you're going to write about. But I think you read a bit and you realize the best stuff. There's a long line of connection from the very, very beginning. You know, one leads on to the next. One is influenced by the next. One takes this from here and that from there. And you begin to realize how interconnected the whole journey is. And then, you know, I love biography. So I particularly love literary biography. So, and, you know, you read enough of them and you begin to see there's a magnificent start usually in a writer's writing life. You know, they're writing to beat the band. And then there's a kind of a gradual slowing down. And then usually there's madness, or there's silence, or there's alcohol, or there's suicide, or there's all of these. And just how very few can do the third act. I'm paraphrasing someone here now, but I can't. There's a line here, Kathleen or Paul might have it, or George, or any of you, but you know that the third act is incredibly difficult to do. You know, anyone can do the first act, and most can probably do the second act. Can you do the third act? And I suppose that is the challenge as you get longer. How do you stay inspired? And I suppose to be connected to the line of writers that you admire and absolutely esteem, I think is a good place to start.
Thank you, Marina. Now, moving on to your experience of teaching creative writing, what seems to be the most difficult things for a student to grasp in your experience?
Structure. Well, I find it very difficult myself. So I can't blame them for that. I think structure is probably the most difficult thing to get one's mind around, because we grow very fond of our sentences. We grow very fond of our favorite little bits in a sequence or whatever. And we don't like to have those taken from us. But, you know, it's all got a lot faster since I started writing. And if you look at the history of the theatre, you know, it began with probably the extended one act, you know, the Greeks. And then, you know, it gradually built up. And so by the time of Shakespeare, then you have 5 acts. That's pretty common. Then it kind of restoration, you know, goes down to 4 acts, then kind of, you know, 3 acts, then kind of become 2 acts. And it seems that we're back again to the extended 1 act. So there's kind of there's a circularity there. Structure, I suppose, is it's very difficult. It's very difficult for me, and I think it's particularly difficult for young students who are beginning to write, because everything in a way has to be sacrificed to structure and I suppose rhythm. So all your favorite passages or your favorite scenes or your favorite chapters or your favorite verse, that has to go if it's not sounding right, or if it's not making sense in the scaffolding of what you're trying to get across. And I think it's very difficult for us all to work with structure, because we tend to think that it's beneath us a bit, that it's something that the plumber does. But I think an awful lot of writing is kind of plumbing and scaffolding and hardwiring and getting that in place. So structure is a very difficult thing to teach, because it's so connected. It's so connected with the personal intention of the writer, the individual who is trying to express something they can't quite bring. Talking with them individually, I find, can help. I find with the best results I get with my students is when the classes can be great as well, and it's great that they have the camaraderie and the conversation among themselves, and they start their own WhatsApp groups and they talk to each other and they talk about what they're writing, what they're reading. And obviously a teacher can't give that amount of time because teachers have other commitments and things to do in other classes to get ready and all of that. But I find when I do have the time with them on one-to-one, that's when I find they really flourish. And I think it's if anything, a big part of our job is taking on the whole person. Yeah, sure, you take on their writing, you take on their drafts, but you actually take on the whole person. And to reiterate what Paul was saying there about confidence building, I think that is paramount. Getting them to the position where they believe they can finish something and finish it well. That would be the achievement. And that takes tremendous amount of work on their part, but it also takes a tremendous amount of work on the teacher, the facilitator's part. It's very, very energy consuming to engage at that level with the students, and because it is their lives you're talking about. Because if writing is about anything, it's about us trying to put in whatever form or genre or art form we work in. It's trying to bring out whatever that thing in us is trying to get out. So it's an alchemical business.
Thanks. That was very insightful. Because of the time, this is actually my last question for you. What's most important? What's the most important thing for the writer's voice to flow in their writing?
Oh my God. Yeah. The most important thing for it to flow, well, God, that's the magic, isn't it? I think digging until you hit the seam would be huge. I think we all know we hit the seam because you're catching up with yourself. Then you're kind of chasing it down, and it's there, and the voice flowing. I mean, not to get too esoteric about it, but all the craft things in place. The voice flowing is the gold. And the voice flowing is when you're at your most humble. It's like what John Donne said, beg from above. He was talking about love as beg from above, a pattern for love. But I always think about that in terms of writing. You can have all the other structures in place. You can have all your reading done. You can have all your craft learned. But if you haven't hit the seam, you might as well just walk away. So that's the mysterious thing. And we all know when it happens. And I suppose we all know more when it doesn't happen, because that's usually the more usual occurrence. But I think you can help it. You can help it by discipline. You can help it by kind of looking after yourself. You can help it by your appointment. They talk about your appointment with the desk, your writing hours. You can help it by showing up, but you can't make that happen. You just hope that that's going to happen. Marina Carr she's a fantastic line. She was in despair. She was in Paris and minding her child, and she had no money, and she's writing. I think it's either to Rilke or Pasternak, and she says, lines come and I let them go. And that's the most devastating thing, I think, for the writer, that the lines come and you're either too lazy or too scattered, or you're just not yourself, or you're not honoring the gift, or you're not honoring the craft, or you're not honoring what you're meant to be doing. So the lines come and you let them go. And when those lines come, they do not come again.
Thank you very much, Marina. I'm sure we'll be talking more at the end of the session. Now I'm passing the floor on to Beatrice back again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina and Aline. And Great to see you again, Marina. And talking about seeing again, welcome back to Brazil and Florianopolis, Kathleen. I'm so pleased to introduce you again. Canadian poet Kathleen McCracken is the author of 8 collections of poetry, including the one I mentioned in the beginning. It's a bilingual collection with translations by José Roberto O'Shea, double self-portrait with mirror, new and selected poems. Kathleen is also the recipient of many awards, and she was finalist for several other competitions and prizes, including the Seamus Heaney Award for New Writing in 2019. She has held several Ontario Arts Council awards and an Individual Artist Award from the Northern Ireland Arts Council. Her poems appeared, apart from the books and collections, in many journals. And she has given readings in Canada, Ireland, Portugal, Brazil, the United Kingdom, and the United States. She's currently lecturer of creative writing and contemporary literature at Ulster University, Northern Ireland. So many thanks as ever, Kathleen. I first thought of beginning with your own work, but then I decided to begin with something more practical. So can you outline the creative writing provision at Ulster University, how the program was developed, and how it is structured, and what are the key objectives in terms of student learning?
Okay, I will try. Thanks, Kate. It's great to be here to see all of you remotely, as we have to do, but it's just lovely to be connected this way and to listen to both of you so far, Marina and Paul, really illuminating for me as somebody who's constantly struggling to, to give the best to students and to work with my own writing at the same time. Ulster, I came to Ulster University in, what year was it? It was 1991, I think. And at that time, there was no creative writing provision to speak of. I mean, within English, people were writing, students were writing, and there were writers on the staff, but it was really the mid-90s, I think, before Robert Welsh, who was then professor of English, established a formal creative writing pathway, as it's still called, through the undergraduate English degree. Prior to that, I mean, as far back as the 70s, and it's well before my time, there were writers in residence. I mean, James Simmons was, I think, there in the 70s and kind of was the first writer that UU boasted to have on staff. Derek Mahon was there, Cathal O'Sharkey, Maeve McGuckian, Paul Muldoon, and yourself, Paul, I think for a while you were writer in residence at UU after doing your PhD there. So there was a tradition of writers being involved with teaching and students, but there wasn't the creative writing provision until the mid-90s. I was a bit surprised by this because from high school back home in Canada, I've been privileged, I guess, that it just was available there, and went to a fairly liberal and progressive high school. So I had creative writing from my high school years. I did a BA in creative writing at York University in Toronto. There was a PhD, I think at that time, the only PhD in Canada was at the University of British Columbia. But now, there are numerous universities there that have pathways and MAs and PhDs. So I was a bit surprised that there wasn't that provision, but very glad when it did come on trend, so to speak, in the 90s. What we have at UU is, it's a series of undergraduate modules, which we call writing, editing, and publishing. So the focus is very much on, well, yes, the students doing their own writing. That's the good half or 3/4 of it, workshopping and portfolio creation. But there's also a lot of emphasis on the publishing industry. I mean, the whole effort to give student employability skills. So we try to, insofar as we can, give them knowledge and information about the publishing industry. I mean, what is an agent? What is a commissioning editor? So there's a kind of industry focus there that to be honest, I mean, I can only go on my own experience, which is fairly minimal, but we do have to kind of bone up and learn this to pass the skills on to them or the knowledge on to them. We also bring in a number of visiting writers, part-time writers. Jan Carson, for instance, this year came in and did some work with us, Moira Donaldson, Deirdre Cartmel. And they too have experience, you know, within publishing industry. So that gets transmitted to students that way. But that's, you know, the focus is largely around all the things you've both been talking about, getting students to read as much as they possibly can and as widely as they want to, and, you know, looking at ways that they can bring that into their own writing, making them feel safe within the workshop environment. And Paul, you talk very interestingly about the workshop, the pros and cons of the workshop, and the way that our degree is structured. In the first 2 years, they don't do any workshop. They do exercises, yes, but they aren't put in a group that you would call a workshop until the final year. And then at MA level, they do that as well. And I think you're right that they do need to learn those skills to begin with, and practice different forms and different structures. And then we find that by final year, they're comfortable enough to begin to work within the workshop environment. And I find it, I mean, I don't teach actually on first and second year now, so I'm pretty much involved with third year and final year and MA students. And they are really comfortable in the workshops. I mean, they will talk quite a lot to each other. I think they get as much, if not more, out of that sometimes than the individual mentorship with me, that they learn from each other. And it's great to see them not just being brave enough to put their own work out there, but learning how to critique courteously other people's work within the workshop. I mean, that is a real skill in itself. And it's lovely to watch them acquire that across that final year. And then some of them do carry on with us into the MA, and those skills are there. So that's kind of the way it's structured. The MA that we have came on, I think it was 2013 that I co-created, I suppose you would say, the co-established the MA that we have. And it's called an MA in English Literature, but again, there's a strand through it where you can come out with sort of 50% creative writing modules and 50% English literature modules. And we're finding that a lot of the students that come to us come for that reason, because there's, you know, they want to have that mixture of studying literature and doing their own writing. They feel that, you know, those two things work really well together rather than doing a pure creative writing MA or a straightforward English Lit MA. So it's something that we're still kind of finding our feet with. Just a couple have said, I would prefer to have a full creative writing MA. Why don't you have one? But the majority, I think, that have come through do like that mixture of the two. The PhD we've had in place, the PhD by practice creative writing, for about 6 years now. And every year we've had more and more applicants. I think so many that we're turning people away, you know, so there are only so many of us, only 2 of us, in fact, that are full-time creative writing lecturers at UU. So we have to be selective, but we've had some really excellent results with the MA. Someone who's working with you now, Paul, Julie Morrissey, came up to us to do her PhD and was really pioneering in a lot of ways, because she was our first PhD by creative writing graduate. So that's the way it's structured. And in some ways, it probably sounds quite fledgling, you know, 6 years, 2013. But in other ways, I think the provision at UU does have deep roots in terms of Northern Irish and Irish writers being with us from the early 70s. Does that answer the question?
Pretty much, yeah, thank you very much. There is even a comment here. This is amazing, from Maria Rita. This is amazing, Kathleen. I'd love something like this at UFSC. Right. So really helpful and for us here. Okay. My next question, Kathleen, refers to something we've talked about many times informally. And it's about the complexities and limitations of the relationship between the creative writer and the academy, the role and challenges for the creative writer in the academy. So, because in certain situations within the academy, creative writers may find themselves having to justify or explain their work as rigorous and scholarly. So how do you see the relationship between creative writing and traditional understandings of impactful academic research?
Yeah, that's a thorny question, isn't it? What I was going to say in relation to this is, I mean, there are times when I'm here 30 years in UU, and mainly the institution has been supportive of what I do. But you do get comments about, well, that's the easy option. You're not really doing academic work. You're not doing true scholarship if you're just writing poetry. And that's a bit hard to take, because you do know yourself that you're constantly writing, you're constantly doing research in different ways and different forms. Paradoxically, sometimes you get that attitude that, because you're a writer, you're sort of on some pedestal or something, you're doing what everybody else studies, and therefore, you're different in that way. But I think actually, we're equal but different. Writers in the institution are doing research. For me, research is just constant, whether it means going to the library and doing archival research, or it's standing and looking out the window. What are the birds doing? That's all research, and any of it might, as you all well know, end up in a piece of your writing. So, but that's hard to justify in a research excellence framework, exercise that comes around every 7 years. I think we have this research excellence framework that I've referred to in the UK. I know it's not quite so emphatically present maybe in the Republic of Ireland or in Brazil, but it was a boost to me anyways, and I think other creative writers that I know, when in 2013, we had our own corral. We were recognized. You could submit creative writing as part of your research submission. Prior to that, it would have been academic books, scholarly books. And what you were saying, Paul, about looking to the other arts, we now feel that we're kind of on a par with music or filmmaking, in that we too can submit our creative work as part of that assessment. So it's felt like we have a bit more status or a bit more recognition within that research exercise. I don't know, I think things like this, symposia like this, conferences, webinars, readings, etc., all of that has helped a lot over the past 10 or more years to raise consciousness within the academy and publicly about the way that writers do research, or the role of research in writing projects, how writers, lecturers are using research into pedagogic practice to inform what they're doing in workshops and classrooms. I mean, that kind of forum for talking about what we do as researchers in relation to our writing has become an area that's more open. There was, when I started anyways, 30 years ago, very little that I was aware of, very little discussion in this direction. And it has become something that we're having a symposium today about, which is wonderful, that too has, I think, contributed to the presence of writers as researchers within the academy. There's also too, I think, writers that I'm interested in and I'm passing on to my students to look at. For instance, somebody like Claudia Rankine, or further back, Muriel Raikheiser, who are combining documentary materials with poetry. And that allows students and anyone who's reading to see that there is research, kind of hard-nosed research, combined or hybridized with creative writing. And so that too, I think, has raised consciousness about the presence of research within practice of poetry anyways, and certainly historical, not fiction. And it's obvious that research goes into creative writing. It's just kind of the recognition of that within the academy has been, I think, slower to come. But I think, I see it, the relationship between research and creative writing, not so much as a binary opposition, but as a kind of positive, productive exchange, a hybridity really that should exist there. There's the enrichment of academic output and impact, and increased ways in which vital knowledge is imparted to audiences and readerships, and most importantly to students, through the way that we're looking for new ways to see and know and disseminate knowledge and experience. Does that come close? I mean, I'm kind of rambling with that, I know, but...
Thank you, Kathleen. So my last question to you, so that we have time to talk to Jorge too, is about your education and your own writing. You've mentioned a little bit about your education before, but could you tell us if there is a relationship between your education and your writing practice? If you studied creative practice, if you didn't, and which opportunities you had that had an impact on your development as a poet?
Yeah, well, I suppose like any writer, and most of us who whether we write or not, your parents, your family are your first educators. And Marina, you were talking about reading and being read to and reading aloud. And I was read to profusely as a child. There are always books around. So I suppose in that way, my family educated me into wanting to write and to tell stories from an early age. I was, as I said earlier, fortunate to have high school classes in creative writing, and I did do that BA in creative writing at university. So I think all of that, was supportive. Without that, I may have written anyway. I may not have, though. I may very well not have written without that kind of educational support network that was there, and the encouragement. I mean, the teacher that I had in high school ensured that I knew about what courses to go to university to take in creative writing. He had me editing a student journal. When I was at university, the writers I was mentored by, people like Frank Davey and B.P. Nichol, Canadian poets, introduced me to publishers that then, became my publishers. So there were those links, and just the workshops, the experience that I had in workshops at university level taught me how to do things for students that would be encouraging and supportive for them. So for me, I know, very lucky in that way, that there's been that example, that model right the way through my education of positive support from educational institutions, and particularly individuals within those institutions.
Thank you, Kathleen. Always a pleasure to talk to you, and I think we have all learned a lot, and looking forward to talking more about creative writing in the future. We now have to close this roundtable and back to Aline, who will talk to Jorge about his own experience here.
Thanks, Beatrice. So it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and almost neighbor, Jorge Alexandre Aires de Menezes Mouzinho, whom sometimes I meet when I go for a walk at UFSC with Arthur. So UFSC has become our backyard, basically, right, during the pandemic. So Jorge is a professor at the Departamento de Língua e Literatura Estrangeiras at Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina. His current research involves the study of eschatological and post-apocalyptic literary and audiovisual narratives in science fiction. Academic interests include film theory, science fiction, adaptation studies, Gothic fiction, cultural studies, and creative writing, among other fields. So, Jorge, my questions to you have to do with both your recent experience working with students in the outreach program that you led with them, and also your personal experience with creative writing. So the first one has to do with your personal experience. Could you tell us about it? What is your personal experience with creative writing?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, I've always kind of been interested in creative endeavors in general. Ever since I was a kid, I kind of I had a lot of reading of, especially comic books. Kind of a bit different from Kathleen. My family, my nuclear family, didn't quite encourage reading for me, but my grandmother always did a good job in providing me with the environment and with the encouragement that I needed at the time. And the thing is, I was always very kind of hyperactive with the way that I consumed art. I was kind of restless that I wasn't comfortable in a position of passive reception, right? So I wanted to take part in what I was reading. So what I did was, and part of that has a lot to do with the experiences I've been having with my students at the study group, where I've grown, where I've got more and more in contact with fan fiction. So what I did back then was basically fan fiction. I took the comic books that I liked and the abridged novels that I read at school, and I kind of made up my own stories about those fictional universes. I was never comfortable in just reading, and I wanted to do my own version of them and to create my own worlds. So that's how I kind of started. But Marina said something I found very significant, very meaningful, which was the third act, right? And going, starting and having an idea and then kicking it off is relatively easy. You still have to go through a lot to kind of to make that happen. But wrapping up and finishing and giving it a sense of closure has always been kind of a difficulty for me. So in a way that comes from a very early age, because I move on to other writings, and when I go back, I don't value what I wrote previously as much. So that's sort of my inner demon. But yeah, growing up and getting more contact with literature itself kind of matured me, and was a process that was very important for me to kind of get to the point in which I know exactly what I like and what I want to write, and I know how to write. I know how to get in the zone and start writing and start creating my stuff. I also like to draw and paint and do other things creatively. So it's something that I can't think of myself without, right? It's always been a part of how I see myself in my everyday life.
Thanks, Georgie. My second question to you has to do with your study group at UFSC. Mm-hmm. How did your creative writing study group get started?
Well, it was back in 2019 when I started here as a substitute professor, and I had a literature in English language literature course with some students, and during the semester, throughout the term, I kind of did some activities with them, some creative activities to kind of get some of that feedback, not just the analytical feedback, not just the reader response, but also in a way, kind of push them to delve into a creative world, right? And to kind of experience how that was firsthand. And some students already did that. They had been doing writing for a while, and I didn't know that. Throughout the semester, they kind of told me. And one student in particular, Julia, I think she's watching this, sent me an email asking us to get together and discuss creative writing and do something that would get people together and kind of start reading each other's writings, and that's how it started. And the way that we found it would best fit what we were looking for was the study group, and we started it informally in 2019, and last year we could officialize it, and yeah, we've been doing it ever since. And yeah, shout out to the people if you're watching this, Julia, Maria Eduarda, Brian, Beatriz, Felipe, everyone who's in the group. There are many more people, Fernanda, and yeah, they've been both a way for me to see that in the environment of the university, something that I didn't see when I was an undergrad student, both from professors or students, from my classmates. I never saw that much interest in experiencing literature from the perspective, from the standpoint of the writer, right? So I was very, very positively surprised to see people interested in taking part in that and starting it. So it's kind of it's something, I know it may sound very cheesy, but it's something that Paul said as well, but we learn a lot with the people that we work with, and I consider students people that I work with, and it's a journey of discovery, I remember Paul said, and I think it's a very nice way of looking at it, of the stages of discovery that we go through when we are writing and when we're getting into the collective aspect of it, which I think is what something like a study group or a workshop is made for.
Georgie, and why should anyone participate in such a project?
I mean, first of all, for what I've just said, the collective aspect of it, it's very easy for people who write or who create anything to isolate themselves, because even a lot of the writing has to do with how we stand alone and how we see our experiences and seeing our own reflections and putting that into some sort of into an outlet of creativity. And it's very easy for us to be, I would say, negatively comfortable in that position. And I think that a study group is like with many other modalities of discussion and academic modalities, you can talk to more people, you can exchange readings, and you can do that. You can do that exchange that I think is so healthy, because people get excited about writing the next assignment and reading each other's texts and talking about the things that they've written and how they felt while they did that. And it's not something that we necessarily do if we're writing by ourselves and just going through our own personal reflections. You can do that with friends at a bar. Obviously, you can always do that and talk to people that have the same interests. But I found that in a study group, especially considering the academic environment, it's that collectivity is more tightly knit.
And this is my last question, really, just to wrap things up.
Mm-hmm.
How can someone get started on creative writing, in your opinion, and what resources should they look for in our context?
Yeah. I mean, there are many resources that you can look for. One of them would be the study group. But how to get started? I think that it's kind of to tune yourself with what makes you comfortable creating, right? It's finding the sort of finding the media or the fields, the style that you're more creative or that you're more comfortable with, and doing things in freestyle. Free-form writing is something that has always worked with me. Something that if I sit down and start writing about something that pops up in my head, it usually works very well, despite thinking that it may be chaotic and going places where you don't know where it's going to end. But I think that starting that in order to find what you're truly comfortable with writing is at least what works with me, and what I've seen people talk about that works with them when they are at initial stages, right? And this is not something I've been doing for long, so I'm still getting that in tune. And I've always written, but I've never got to the point where I could, like I said before, collectively talk about creative writing like I'm doing now. Because I don't know if it was Kathleen who said this, but I myself, when I was in my undergrad course, I didn't even know it was possible to have like a creative writing group or some sort of academic activity that would involve that directly. I would just we would read these writers, but we would not have the perspective of the writing itself. So I think that you can find that with yourself, but finding what you're comfortable with other people is even better. And once you do that, look for, I mean, today we have many online tools for that. You look for workshops or online courses. There are many out there. And if not for the quality of the course, at least for the momentum that you can build up while taking part in that. So I think that's very important. A study group, talking to people that think alike, going into forums. I mean, today we have in Brazil, our context is a bit trickier for that, but we have had for a while now a very, I mean, at least I haven't taken, but people say that it's a very nice course at PUC in Rio Grande do Sul, and now that you can specialize in other facilities, in other universities. So I think that it's getting better now. We're getting to the point where more people are trying to incorporate creative writing into literary studies, and even doing it aligned with a sense of critical reading, right? Because that's also very important. But it's another thing that I used to do that I think it's very positive for people who are starting, or people who write every day, is seeing what writers say about writing, right? So an opportunity like this is invaluable, because we are here together with creative people, and listening to them and hearing them say what they think about writing, and these reflections, I think, that are something that, if you are willing to have that first contact and build up that confidence, you can do that. I think it's invaluable. And see that when you write, we have these very crystallized notions of who writers are and what they represent, and they are very distant people, and we tend to canonize them in many ways. And I think that reading what writers have to say about writing, I think that was crucial for me. So reading Gabriel Garcia Marques, and Assis Brasil has a beautiful book, Escrever Ficção, published in Brazil. I think it's very nice. And what these people have to say about writing, and finding that model that will work for you, whether you want to write poetry, or if you want to write prose or chronicles or autobiographical writing, it's very important that you feel comfortable, and that you see that other people do that, and that there is basically the essence of it is experience and exchange, right?
Thank you very much, Roger. We are looking into implementing a program on creative writing at UFSC. So, this is one of the purposes of this roundtable, to start thinking about it, joining our thinking hats. So thank you so much for this. And I'm sure there will be plenty of questions coming from the audience as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. Apparently, no one is sending questions. So anyway, yeah, the audience is shy today, but it doesn't matter. I have one question for Katherine. Which approach do you think was the most efficient with your students at Ulster? If there is one.
Yes, I suppose off the top of my head, I would say the one-on-one kind of tuition. I know, Marina, you were talking about how much energy and time that takes, and no truer words spoken about that, because it really does take a lot to focus on one student and give them what they need. But I find that when I can afford to do that, that usually reaps the most benefits for them, and also for me, in terms of the improvement in their style. When you can show them, very individual, particular problems that they are having, whether it's with structure or even diction and syntax and things like that, bigger issues as well. I mean, if you can do that one-on-one, that really pays off. But as I was saying, I think what they get back from other students in their writing groups, whether it's the workshop or individual, one-on-one groups that they create themselves, as you were referring to, George. They learn a lot from that. They learn a lot from reading the kind of books that you're mentioning, George, just a few moments ago. That example, that other writers journal, the struggles they go through or the things they're interested in. Much of the reading list that I would give them would be to look at exactly those kind of texts where, they feel that they're part of a community of writers, global community of writers. Those things, I think, are what I would say are have give students the most, in my experience.
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen. We have one question from José Roberto O'Shea. Going back to the pros and cons workshop dynamics, would any of you care to talk about the so-called workshop poem? The question is to all of you.
Well, I'm not a poet, so not me.
Well, I mean, I could start off, Kathleen, if you like. I mean, but by that question, I understand two things. The first thing I understand that question asking is about a kind of a consensus culture that can be created in a workshop, so that the poet or the student poet is trying to create a poem that will curry favor with workshop participants, and if they do so, it could thereby compromise its more outstanding qualities. So what I find is, on the spectrum of poems that are offered for critique or feedback or workshop, many of them come into this kind of middle ground. But when you've worked, and by that I mean not taking risks, not actually expressing the individual quirks and idiosyncrasies of the poet, person, student writing the poem. They're trying to satisfy an audience, in other words, that is separate and other to them. And I think part of the workshop process can, again, instill in them the confidence that some of the audience before them are not going to care for, like, or appreciate the work that they're doing, and that's okay. In fact, what I encourage my writers to do is to cultivate their own idiosyncrasies and to move from the center of that spectrum of consensus to the own vagaries and wildfires in their imagination, which again will not meet with everybody's favor, but which will kind of create a path for them to follow, their own furrow, in other words. So that would be one answer about the workshop poem. I mean, when I was a student at University of Houston, our teachers were Edward Hirsch and Adam Zagiewski, and we talked about the Houston style, this long line. So we kind of influenced each other, but I don't really see anything wrong with that in and that certain styles or schools, if you like, can be created maybe in larger communities, whether it's the New York School of Poets, or whether it's the Harlem Renaissance, or whether it's the Southern Gothic in the United States, and I'm sure you have the Brazilian equivalents. And in that, that's just something that comes about on a larger scale. So in a way, the workshop is a microcosm of the larger community, the society, and a kind of the global impact that different writing can have. I've kind of got away with myself there, so I'll hand you over to Kathleen.
Well, I don't know, George, do you want to say anything about that? Because you've been leading workshops or groups recently.
Well, I mean, the way we do our activities is basically is following prompts and suggestions of exercise. When it comes to poetry, I will admit I did less than I would like to. It's less, how can I say? It's less common to find people who are willing to write poetry. But we do have one student, and Maria Eduarda, and she writes wonderfully. And we did some exercises in the beginning, playing around with you know, with the line, the ideas of rhyme and rhythm, and incorporating sort of like an adaptation mentality from painting, for example, writing a poem that would describe painting. And while I liked the results, it was admittedly very, it was the most sparse, I would say, the activity that went with less people, right? So the experience that I've had with the study group is basically, it's focused more on prose than poetry. But I mean, I would be lying if I said that I wouldn't love to have poetry poetry dynamics again, and to talk to people about poetry and how they feel about both reading and writing. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Jorge. Now we have loads of questions, but we are reaching the end of the roundtable. But there is one question I'd like to ask Marina to close the session, and it's from Maria Rita Viana. Marina, great to see you again. Thinking about the kind of approach Kathleen mentioned they have at Ulster, would anything like that be possible in the creative writing classes for drama like yours?
Sorry, you mean in general, the way I teach drama, or I don't understand?
Yeah, the kind of approach that Kathleen mentioned, probably think of poetry and fiction. How do you structure your own drama?
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, I always start with a bit of Beckett. I think you can't go wrong in the playwriting. We start with the monologue, and we work on from there. So spend quite a bit of time on Beckett's monologues, just looking at the structure, looking at the solo voice. And they're particularly brilliant on, you know, you can work a lot with students on them. They're, you know, punctuation or lack of repetitions, rhythm, and, you know, they're a very good place to start, I suppose, or any monologue is a good place to start with playwriting. And then we move on to 2 character scenes and 3 character scenes, and kind of build it from there. And then I suppose the thing about teaching playwriting is there's so many visual aspects as well that have to kind of align. You have to kind of think in images. You have to imagine the setting where your scene or your play is taking place, or your monologue, whatever it is. And then you have to be able to imaginatively transpose that to a stage setting. So a lot of things have to align. Entrance, like all the nuts and bolts and stuff that we all think are a given, but the students coming, because we've been doing it for so long, you sometimes forget that actually you just have to point this very basic stuff out. And once you do, then a lot of them are. So I think a very, very kind of practical approach is good initially. I never really start. I kind of end up with the Greek stuff, because I find even with master students level, they find that just too much to begin with. They want more contemporary stuff. They want modernism forwards, really. And then you can go back later in the year, maybe second semester, when they've done quite a bit of reading. But again, I find I'm not really that interested in them in writing the first couple of weeks, and they're mad to write. But I'm really not interested in them writing until they've read a bit of what's prescribed for the seminar. And I find the ones that who progress fastest are the ones who read most. I know I keep going back to that bugbear, but they are the ones who take on what they've read. And there's something about the immediacy. There's something about reading 10 plays over a weekend and then sitting down to write a scene that is kind of very inspiring, as opposed to sitting down thinking, I am a genius, let it come, you know? So it's trying to gently disabuse all of us of that notion. Of course, the odd time the thing will come, but that's too rare to depend on. You need the technique, you need the craft. So I'd be banging on about that a lot of the time. That's basically the structure. We end up with the classics. We do them. We have a class in the masters we teach called Reading Like a Writer, and the three of us. There are three writers who teach on that master. So we take a third each, and my third is we spend 7 weeks reading Hamlet out loud together, and just stopping and starting. And some of them don't really like that, but some of them love it. And some of them start off thinking, what is the point of this? And by the end of it, they see the point. And my point is very simple, is that you want to write plays, you have to read Hamlet, and probably should be reading them, you know, a lot. So it's all different. It's all different approaches, I think. And you know, you tailor your class and you modify as you go along. And the more you deal with the students to their, what they particularly need at the time.
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen. George, there are questions about how to join the study group, but I guess people can probably contact you via email or write to the program. So we can't thank you enough for taking your time to be here with us. This was just fascinating. And I'm sure we will watch it again and again and again in the YouTube channel to reflect again about all the wonderful concerns and issues and thoughts that were raised here this afternoon. So if Aline wants to say something to close, and we'll probably go.
I just want to thank you all for this session, and to let you know that we'll be in touch, because we want to think about curriculum and courses. So thank you very much for this.
Pleasure.
I want to thank everyone too. And for the person who wants to join, just email me, idismozinho@gmail.com. And yeah, definitely, you'd be welcome. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, and see you, hopefully. Bye. Ciao.
Bye, everyone.
Ciao.